White lady kicks black woman out of her store, gasps when she's the CEO. Rose felt the chill of the morning wind brush against her cheeks as she stepped out of her car, her breath forming little clouds in the crisp air. Her heart fluttered nervously, more than she cared to admit. Mornings had always been her favorite time of day, a sacred space where each dawn offered a new beginning. She loved how the sun cast elongated shadows that quickly morphed into the bright shapes of daylight, promising that anything was possible. That day, however, held a distinct energy that she couldn't name, a tug at her intuition suggesting something important was about to unfold. She took a moment to straighten the hem of her jacket and brush off a few stray flecks of dust from her pants. Glancing at her reflection in the tinted car window, she forced a small but determined smile. "Okay," she whispered to herself, "here we go." She was in a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everybody supposedly knew everybody else, and newcomers weren't always welcomed with open arms. The street was lined with locally owned shops boasting hand-painted signs and antique lamp posts festooned with patriotic ribbons. The architecture was a mosaic of historical buildings and newer establishments attempting to blend in. As Rose walked, her heels tapping against the sidewalk, a few people gave her the cordial nod that strangers often exchange in quiet towns. She appreciated the courtesy but felt something else lurking beneath. A fleeting glance here, a sidelong look there, a hesitation she was all too familiar with. Still, she had no intention of letting suspicion ruin her day. She had come here in search of an antique bookstore she remembered from childhood. Her late mother had often mentioned it, describing lazy Saturday mornings spent sipping hot cocoa while browsing rare editions of old classics. But in the years since her mother's passing, Rose had never actually visited. That morning, she decided it was time to see if the place still existed. If, by some miracle, it had survived the modern shift toward e-readers and big-box bookstores. She had an address scribbled on a little notepad and a mental image of what the place might look like. Ornate wooden shelves, the musty yet comforting scent of aging paper, a warm lamp illuminating a quiet reading nook in the corner. The shop, if it was still around, was rumored to be owned by a local family that took pride in preserving the town's historical landmarks. Rose imagined the owners as older folks with silver hair and a gentle manner, possibly wearing aprons dusted with hints of bookbinding glue or dried ink from vintage printing presses. She pictured them greeting customers with a warm smile, offering recommendations from decades of collective knowledge. Perhaps, once inside, she'd find a priceless old volume that her mother might have once held in her own hands, bridging the gap between past and present. As she turned the corner, Rose spotted a quaint storefront with tall windows framed by painted shutters. The sign above read, MARLOW and DAUGHTRS Antiques in a careful script, the gold lettering chipped in places. The front windows displayed an assortment of antique vases, ornate picture frames, and some old books stacked precariously. It looked promising, though the sign implied it wasn't just a bookstore but an antique shop. Nonetheless, her heart gave a tiny leap of excitement. She felt a sudden urge to rush through the door to confirm whether it housed the treasures and memories she sought. She stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the scent of old wood and the faint aroma of something floral, perhaps potpourri or an essential oil diffuser hidden somewhere behind the counter. The space was smaller than she had imagined, but cozy, with well-worn hardwood floors that squeaked underfoot. Shelves packed with books lined one wall, and along the others were antiques of every shape and size. Brass candlesticks, porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware sets, delicate lace tablecloths, and intricately carved wooden boxes. At first glance, it felt like a place that held its own stories and secrets. Rose let the door close softly behind her, not wanting to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. She wandered through the narrow aisles, gently brushing her fingertips across the spines of old novels, some with faded titles barely legible. In the background, she heard classical music playing softly, maybe. It reminded her of quiet Sunday afternoons at home, her mother humming tunes in the kitchen. Each step she took felt both exhilarating and comforting, like she was on a treasure hunt for a moment in time she thought she'd lost. That initial sense of wonder was short-lived. As Rose rounded a corner, she heard the distinct click of heels on wood, accompanied by a sharp intake of breath. A woman stood at the far side of the store, behind a tall counter. Her platinum hair was styled neatly in a bob, and she wore a crisp white blouse under a pastel cardigan. She looked up from a pile of receipts or papers, eyes narrowing in Rose's direction. In a town this small, Rose might have expected a warmer greeting, maybe a friendly wave or a polite smile. Instead, the woman's expression tensed, suspicion flaring in her pale blue eyes. For an awkward moment, neither spoke. Finally, Rose offered what she hoped was a disarming smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "I'm just looking around. I hope that's all right." The woman pressed her lips into a tight line. She fiddled with the collar of her cardigan, glancing up and down as if assessing Rose from head to toe. "We don't see too many new faces," she replied after a pause, her tone clipped. "Are you from around here?" "Not really," Rose admitted. "I'm visiting. My mother used to talk about an old bookstore in this town, and I've been trying to find it. I was hoping this might be the place." "Bookstore?" the woman echoed, arching an eyebrow. "We do have books, yes, but we're more of a specialty antique shop. We don't get many browsers who aren't locals." Rose noticed the slight hesitation in the woman's voice, as though she struggled to choose a word that wouldn't sound too blunt or dismissive. Yet the woman's gaze seemed pointed, almost predatory, making Rose feel unwelcome. She tried to shrug it off. "I'm sorry if I intruded. I was just hoping to see if there were any rare volumes or something that might ring a bell from my mother's descriptions." The woman's expression hardened. She stepped out from behind the counter, her posture rigid. "I'm Sharon. I run this place." The introduction was almost an afterthought, delivered with little warmth. "We keep our most valuable items behind the counter. And frankly, if you're not intending to buy." Rose blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I'm definitely interested in purchasing if I find something that has sentimental or historical value," she offered, trying to keep her voice calm. "That's what they all say," Sharon murmured, just loud enough for Rose to hear. "Some people come in just to loiter and touch everything." She cast a glance at Rose's hands as though expecting them to be sticky or careless. Rose sucked in a breath, a prickle of indignation rising in her chest. She thought about turning around and leaving right then, but a stubborn part of her refused to be pushed out so easily. She could leave, but that would mean forfeiting the chance to honor her mother's memory, so she decided to push on politely. "Your store is beautiful," she said, hoping to de-escalate the tension. "I'd love to look around a bit more if that's okay." Sharon forced a thin smile. "Of course." Then she turned sharply on her heel and walked away. The tension in her shoulders didn't fade as she resumed her spot behind the counter, staring daggers at Rose as she moved among the displays. Trying to ignore the woman's watchful eyes, Rose carefully examined the antique furniture and the rows of books, occasionally pausing to look at a cover or run her finger down a worn spine. Her heart sank a bit as she realized many of the titles were about local history or genealogies, a niche interest, not exactly the cozy classics she was hoping to find. Still, she kept up her exploration, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "Sometimes you find the greatest treasures in the most unexpected places." She had almost convinced herself that perhaps she'd come to the wrong shop entirely when she noticed a small section near the back, separated from the rest by a tall bookshelf that formed a sort of nook. The sign above read "Rare and Collectible." She felt a thrill of anticipation and headed there. That was when she heard Sharon's voice again, a little louder this time. "Excuse me," Sharon called out. "That area is for serious buyers only." Rose turned perplexed. "I'm sorry, I was just—" Sharon briskly walked over, her footsteps echoing with authority. "Those pieces back there aren't for casual viewing," she snapped. "They're expensive. They need delicate handling. Only clients with appointments go there." Her gaze bore into Rose's, unwavering and filled with accusation. Rose drew herself up, her chest tightening. "I understand the need to protect valuable items," she said, keeping her voice even. "But your sign doesn't say anything about appointments." "It doesn't have to," Sharon retorted, crossing her arms. "Everyone in town knows we keep that area restricted." Rose bristled under the insinuation that she wasn't from around here, and therefore was out of line. She also sensed another element at play, an unspoken prejudice lurking behind the woman's coldness. Rose had encountered moments like this before. The subtle looks, the quiet condescension that made it clear she was not welcomed in certain spaces. She swallowed, the bitter taste in her mouth, trying to keep her composure. "All right, I'll stay out," she said softly. "I'm sorry if I caused any inconvenience." Sharon sighed, appearing both annoyed and smug. "Thank you," she said curtly, turning on her heel once more to head back to the counter. Rose exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she wandered to another corner of the store, not really sure what she was looking at anymore. Decorative plates, old typewriters, vintage postcards from decades gone by. She tried to let her frustration dissipate, telling herself that maybe Sharon was just overprotective of her merchandise. But the longer she stayed, the more she felt singled out, as though her every move was under scrutiny. A few minutes later, a bell jangled at the door and an older couple entered, greeting Sharon warmly. She came around the counter to embrace them, her entire demeanor transformed. She laughed pleasantly, her voice filled with warmth. "Welcome back, I was just sorting some new items. Let me show you what we've got." In that moment, Rose felt as if she had become invisible, or at the very least, relegated to some lesser status. She heard the trio's voices merge into a gentle hum of conversation as they strolled about the store. Occasionally, Sharon would throw a suspicious glance in Rose's direction, as if to remind her she was being watched. Finally, Rose decided she had enough. The store wasn't what she had hoped for, and the owner's attitude was more than enough reason to leave. She also felt drained, emotionally, having come in with such optimism only to be made to feel like she didn't belong. She gave one more quick scan of the shelves, in case she might spot something that resonated with her mother's stories, but found nothing. As she headed toward the exit, she felt a knot of disappointment tightening in her stomach. She was almost at the door when Sharon's voice rang out sharply, loud enough that the older couple turned their heads. "Don't forget, miss, we don't allow photographs or handling items without permission." Rose turned, bewildered. She wasn't taking any photos, nor had she touched anything. Realizing the accusation, Rose felt a wave of indignation wash over her. But she didn't want to make a scene, so she responded calmly, "I understand." Sharon started, her gaze filled with a combination of contempt and triumph, as though she'd won some small battle by asserting authority. Then she waved dismissively, as if brushing away an unwanted presence. Rose sighed, pushed open the door, and stepped back onto the sidewalk. The crisp morning had turned into a bright midday, but the sunshine offered little comfort. She felt singled out, humiliated, and most of all, disappointed that her journey to reconnect with her mother's memory had led to an ugly confrontation with prejudice. For a few moments, Rose lingered on the sidewalk, looking at the store's exterior. Her reflection in the glass door seemed smaller than usual, overshadowed by the swirling emotions inside her. "What a shame," she murmured to herself. "Mom, I'm sorry. I guess this wasn't the place you loved." With a heavy sigh, she decided to explore the rest of the quaint downtown, hoping to salvage something good out of the day. As she walked along the street, she noticed the other shops, bakeries selling homemade pastries, boutiques featuring local artisans, a cozy with wrought-iron tables outside. Maybe she would treat herself to lunch and regroup. She looked across the road and spotted a bookstore. It wasn't old-fashioned in the romantic sense she had envisioned, but it had tall shelves visible through the large windows and a sign that read, "Harlows Books and more." It occurred to her that maybe her mother's favorite haunt had changed names or ownership. She decided to give it a try, crossing at the intersection and making her way inside. An energetic young man behind the counter greeted her with a bright smile. "Welcome, Tus," he said cheerfully, not even a shred of the disdain she'd encountered earlier. The store was smaller than a chain bookstore, but had a warm feel to it. Comfy chairs, well-organized shelves, and even a small coffee station. It didn't exactly feel antique or nostalgic, but it was inviting. Rose smiled back, inhaling the scent of fresh paper and coffee beans. "Thanks," she replied. "Is there a special section for used or rare books?" "Absolutely," he said. "It's in the back left corner. We have a small but interesting collection." He went on to describe how they acquired estate sale items and occasionally stumbled upon out-of-print editions. Rose thanked him and headed that way. While browsing, she felt her shoulders relax. Here, no one was hovering over her and no suspicious looks followed her movements. She picked up a few titles, flipping through the pages. A battered copy of Pride and Prejudice caught her eye, her mother's favorite. It wasn't particularly rare, but it held sentimental value. She imagined her mother reading the novel aloud, doing character voices, laughing at Mr.'s dry humor. It brought a pang of sadness, but also a kind of quiet joy, remembering how stories bound them together. She decided to purchase the copy, if only to have a physical reminder of her mother's love for reading. On her way to the cashier, she noticed a sign posted on the bulletin board. "Looking for temporary community space? Contact Harlows Books. We host events and clubs." She paused, reading the fine print. They were open to hosting local clubs, business gatherings, or any group that needed a welcoming environment. An idea sparked in her mind, though she wasn't sure if it was the right place or the right time to act on it. Still, Rose's professional instincts couldn't be entirely ignored. Outside of this personal trip, she was also scoping out potential locations for a philanthropic project her corporation was spearheading, initiatives that supported small businesses and promoted literacy. She had quietly visited several towns over the last year, hoping to find an authentic small-town vibe where her foundation could launch a reading program and sponsor local entrepreneurs. Perhaps in a place like this, she could connect with community leaders, people open to growth, who shared the values of inclusivity and literacy. She bought the Pride and Prejudice copy, thanking the cashier for his kindness. Before leaving, she jotted down a note to contact the store about potentially hosting a small literacy event if it ever lined up with her schedule. She headed back to her car, placing the book on the passenger seat carefully. A sliver of excitement warmed her chest despite the earlier encounter at the antique shop. It reminded her that not everyone in this town was like Sharon. Maybe her mother's memory could be honored here in a different way than she'd first imagined. Still, Sharon's hostility gnawed at her. Had it really been about Rose's being a stranger in a close-knit community, or was there another layer, something uglier? Rose was used to navigating microaggressions, unspoken assumptions, and the coded language that frequently accompanied them. She had learned to cope by letting most of it roll off her shoulders, focusing on the bigger goals. But it never stopped hurting, especially on a day she had hoped to feel closer to her mom. The sting lingered. A few days later, Rose found herself still thinking about that shop and daughters, and the icy woman who ran it. She had been staying at a nearby lodge, planning on quietly touring the town for a week. Part of her wanted to just forget about the humiliating experience. Another part, however, was driven by a sense of justice. Something about being made to feel unworthy or untrustworthy just wouldn't sit right with her. She was the type of person who believed in second chances, in open communication, but she also believed that prejudices needed to be addressed. Keeping silent would only perpetuate the cycle. Midweek, as she walked the main street again, she happened to see a "For Lease" sign in the window of a large storefront just across from and Daughters. The space was bigger than many of the shops in town, with a wide entrance and tall windows perfect for displays. The interior, from what she could see, was mostly empty. A spark of inspiration flared. She could almost envision a lively, inclusive community hub, maybe an reading lounge, or an event space for local artists and authors, or a co-working area for small businesses. This might be exactly the sort of location her organization could invest in, turning it into a revitalized anchor for the neighborhood. And ironically, it faced Sharon's store, which made Rose wonder if that was too pointed a statement, or simply poetic justice. Her phone buzzed. It was her assistant calling to confirm the following week's schedule. Rose stepped aside, leaning against a lamppost. "Yes," she said, forcing her focus back to business. "I'm still out here doing research. I think I might have found an interesting spot." "Is it for the literacy program?" asked, enthusiasm in her voice. "Possibly more than that," Rose answered. "It could be a multi-purpose space for community events. We could integrate the reading program, sponsor local craft fairs, host workshops. You know how we talked about bridging the gap between corporate initiative and community authenticity? This feels like it has potential." Made an affirmative sound. "That's great news. You want me to start drafting some proposals." Rose's eyes lingered on the vacant building's facade. "Yes, but let's keep it quiet for now. I want to talk to some locals first, gauge the vibe. We need community buy-in if we're going to do this the right way." "Understood," said. "Oh, and we still have that board meeting next month. The CEO's attendance is mandatory, just a reminder." Rose chuckled lightly. "Don't worry, I'll be there. I wouldn't miss it." Hanging up, she stared at the "For Lease" sign for a few more moments, her mind awash in possibilities. Despite her excitement, she couldn't completely forget about Sharon's cold treatment. Something about that encounter had dug under her skin, planting a seed of defiance. If she moved forward with this new community space, she wanted to ensure it stood for everything Sharon's store seemed not to: openness, warmth, inclusivity. Maybe it was a bit petty, but she also wanted to show that no matter how unwelcoming some people might be, there was still room for something better. The next day, Rose attended a small community meet and greet at the local town hall. She had found the event listed on a public bulletin board in the lodge lobby. advertised as a casual gathering for residents to discuss upcoming town projects and volunteer initiatives. She reasoned it was the perfect opportunity to meet real locals, beyond the shop owners, and get a feel for their concerns, their hopes, their everyday realities. Dressed modestly but professionally, she arrived at the historic building, its brick walls and wooden doors speaking of old-world charm. Inside, clusters of residents mingled near folding tables laden with homemade cookies, brownies, and coffee urns. Conversations swelled and ebbed, punctuated by laughter and friendly banter. A retired teacher was talking about the need for after-school programs. A local farmer mentioned a plan to start an organic market. A group of teenagers chatted about the lack of recreational spaces. Rose moved quietly among them, introducing herself as someone interested in the town's potential. She didn't flaunt her corporate affiliation or her own wealth. She preferred to listen first. During a conversation about preserving the town's heritage, an older gentleman named Harold mentioned and daughters. "They've been here for generations," he noted. "Used to be just antiques, but they started adding books a few years back when Sharon decided to branch out. Not always the friendliest place, if you ask me, but they do carry some rare finds." Rose tried to keep her tone neutral. "So, they've been part of the community for a long time." "Yeah, they are an old family around here," Harold replied. "Sharon took over after her parents passed. She's protective, let's say. Especially about outsiders." Rose nodded, choosing not to reveal her own negative experience. She politely asked about other local businesses, gathering information about which places were most beloved. It turned out Books was a local favorite, as was the next door and a bakery run by a family who had emigrated from Italy decades ago. People cherished the sense of community these places fostered. Later, the mayor gave a short speech about the importance of local business revitalization and the need for new endeavors that could stimulate tourism and cultural exchange. Rose took mental notes, seeing a clear alignment with her philanthropic goals. Afterward, she introduced herself to the mayor as Rose Taylor, a concerned visitor interested in potential community-building projects. The mayor, a tall woman with salt-and-pepper hair, shook Rose's hand warmly and offered her a seat at one of the round tables. Over cups of coffee, they discussed the various ways the town could benefit from partnership with an organization that supported small business growth and literacy initiatives. The mayor seemed genuinely enthused by Rose's ideas. "We could really use a community center that doubles as a cultural hub," she said. "Something that preserves our traditions but also welcomes new influences." Rose's heart quickened with excitement. "I might know of a space," she replied carefully, not wanting to overcommit. "I've seen a vacant storefront that could be perfect for such a center." The mayor's eyes lit up. "Oh, that old Johnson building? Yes, that's a big space and it's been empty for too long. The landlord is eager to lease it. If you're serious, the town council would definitely want to hear more." They exchanged contact information, and Rose promised to put together a preliminary proposal. She left the town hall feeling lighter, optimism coursing through her. She was doing exactly what she had come to do, bridging her personal interests and her corporate mission to create something meaningful. The run-in with Sharon was still a sore spot, but now Rose had a sense of purpose that transcended that negativity. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, quiet negotiations, and discreet site visits. She examined the vacant Johnson building more closely, took measurements, and took notes on renovations that might be needed. She spoke with the landlord, a soft-spoken man who was willing to negotiate a fair lease for a worthy project. She also checked in with her contacts back in the city to see if her philanthropic foundation's budget could handle the investment. So far, everything seemed feasible. It was on the 5th day of her stay that Rose decided to re-enter and daughters. She wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps part of her wanted to see if things could be different on a second meeting, or if her gut feeling had been correct all along. Another part of her wanted to confirm whether they had any old documents or historical items that might be useful in designing her center's interior. Old maps, local photographs, such pieces could add authenticity to the space. She steeled herself before opening the door, recalling Sharon's frosty demeanor. The bell jingled. The store was nearly empty, except for a middle-aged man browsing near the porcelain displays. And there was Sharon behind the counter, perched on a tall stool with her legs crossed at the ankle. She looked up with a start, her eyes narrowing as soon as she recognized Rose. "You again," Sharon muttered, her voice lacking any semblance of welcome. "Back to browse." Rose took a breath. Yes, actually, I'm interested in some local historical items. Photographs, documents, maps, anything that might showcase the town's heritage. Sharon let out a thin, humorless laugh. You plan to buy something this time or just look? Rose kept her voice calm. If you have what I need, I'll purchase it. I'm working on a local project. Something in the way Rose spoke must have pricked Sharon's suspicion. I see, she said slowly. Well, I don't have much in the way of that, but you're free to look through the bins in the back. She paused. Stay out of the restricted section, though. We've had too many curious hands damage items lately. Rose felt a wave of anger flash through her, but she swallowed it. She gave a curt nod, heading to the back as directed. The man who was browsing looked up, shooting Rose a sympathetic glance as though he, too, had felt the sting of Sharon's attitude. Rose offered him a small, resigned smile, then continued to the rear of the shop. She found a set of wire racks containing old postcards, black and white photographs, and some old newspapers, all wrapped in plastic sleeves. She flipped through them methodically, noting which ones might fit the aesthetic of a community space. Occasionally, she paused to admire a beautiful vintage photograph of the town square, or a snippet of a 1950s newspaper ad. She selected a handful to potentially purchase and laid them gently on a small table. Suddenly, Sharon's voice sliced through the quiet. Hey, stop shuffling them around like that. Rose looked up. I'm just picking out which ones I might buy. I'm being very careful. Sharon strode forward, her eyes raking over the pile Rose had made. These are fragile, she hissed. You can't just rummage through them like they're junk. You people never respect how delicate antiques are. The phrase you people felt like a slap. Rose froze, her lips parting in shock. She had encountered enough subtle prejudice in her life to recognize this particular phrase as a red flag. Her stomach tightened. I'm aware they're delicate, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I've handled collectibles before. Oh, have you now? Sharon retorted. I'm sure you have all kinds of expertise. Her voice dripped with condescension. Rose set her jaw, trying to remain composed, but the tension in her body was mounting. She glanced around, noticing the other customer had moved closer, perhaps drawn by the raised voices. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to speak calmly. I'd like to purchase these items, she said, gesturing to the selection she'd set aside. Could you ring them up? Sharon eyed the small stack, her lips pursed. We usually sell these to serious collectors, people who can appreciate their value, not someone who's going to tack them up on a dorm wall or something. Rose's fists clenched at her sides. I'm not buying them for a dorm wall, she said softly but firmly. They'll be used in a community-centered project that pays respect to the town's history. Sharon sniffed. Community-centered project, right. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen you before this week. What kind of project would that be? Rose took a deliberate breath. She didn't owe Sharon any explanation, but maybe if she was transparent, it would help. I'm working with a philanthropic foundation to open a community space in the Johnson building. It'll include areas for local artisans, reading programs, and historical exhibits. I'd like these items to help showcase the town's heritage. Sharon's eyes narrowed, something like disdain flickering across her face. You mean that big empty building across the street from me? A wry smile tugged at her lips. So that's your plan, turn this place into some tourist trap, I bet. Rose shook her head. Not at all. I want to partner with local businesses, give them a space to reach more people, host reading clubs and cultural events, build something beneficial for everyone who lives here. The other customer shifted uncomfortably, as if tempted to say something but holding back. Sharon stared at Rose for a long moment, then she let out a scoff. Keep your illusions if you want, she said, but I know people like you. You come in with big talk about community and synergy. You buy a few postcards, maybe set up some fancy displays, but eventually you move on and leave us all with the mess. I'd rather keep things the way they are. Rose's eyes hardened. She could sense the conversation heading down a darker path if she continued to engage. Part of her wanted to call Sharon out for her prejudice. Part of her wanted to just walk away. But she remembered her mother's gentle voice reminding her that anger was rarely the best teacher. With measured calm, she said, I don't want to argue with you. I just want to buy these items and leave. Sharon took the stack from Rose's hands, flipping through them quickly. Then, to Rose's shock, she announced, Actually, I don't think I can sell these. They're not for sale. Rose blinked, stunned by the blatant contradiction. They're in a bin marked for sale, she pointed out. Sharon shrugged, crossing her arms. They were mislabeled. They're part of my personal collection. I'm sorry, but I won't let them go. Rose realized that Sharon simply didn't want to sell to her. The brazenness of it took her breath away. She couldn't believe the woman's capacity for petty cruelty. The other customer, perhaps sensing the injustice, cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Sharon," he said softly, "but if those were mislabeled, maybe you should remove them from the bin altogether." Sharon shot him a glare. "Thank you, but I can handle it." Rose felt her face heat. She knew a confrontation was about to erupt. She also felt a deep sense of principle stirring inside her. This was about more than some postcards. It was about Sharon's thinly veiled bigotry, her unwelcoming attitude, the hostility toward an outsider who happened to be a black woman. But Rose also wanted to maintain dignity. She took a step back, scanning Sharon's face. The woman's rigid posture, the smug half-smile on her lips, it all screamed that she believed she was in control, that she believed Rose was powerless. Rose inhaled slowly, then said, "All right, if you don't want to sell them, that's fine. I'll leave." There was a tremor in her voice as anger warred with hurt. "I really hope one day you'll see that what I'm doing is to help this town." "I'm not your enemy." Sharon let out a short, bitter laugh. "We don't need your help," she replied, "and we don't need you." The words hit Rose like a slap. A wave of emotion swept over her, rage, sorrow, frustration. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes but blinked them back, refusing to let Sharon see them. Summoning every ounce of pride she had, she turned on her heel and headed for the door. Just as she reached it, Sharon's voice rang out loud enough that the man named winced. "And don't come back," she yelled, her tone echoing off the shelves. "We don't serve your kind here." In that instant, Rose felt time slow. She paused, her hand on the door handle, her eyes closed as she let the enormity of that hateful statement wash over her. "We don't serve your kind here." A phrase so loaded with the ugliest parts of history. A phrase that hammered home the reality that prejudice was alive and well. Slowly, Rose opened the door and stepped outside. The bell jingled again, but this time it felt more like a final verdict than a greeting. On the sidewalk, Rose let out a shuddering breath, tears threatening. She had encountered racism before, but it never ceased to shock and wound. For a moment, she considered bursting back into the store and demanding an apology. But what good would that do? Sharon had shown her true colors, and no immediate confrontation was going to change her ingrained bigotry. Rose felt heartbreak, yes, but also a steely resolve. She turned and looked at the Johnson building across the street, standing vacant like a blank canvas waiting for inspiration. In that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. She would make the community space a reality, and it would stand in stark contrast to Sharon's store. It would be a place of inclusion, culture, learning, a place that welcomed everyone, no matter their background. She squared her shoulders and began walking toward her car, each step fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Rose had extended her stay, working tirelessly with local contractors, meeting with the mayor and members of the town council, and hammering out the details of the lease with the Johnson Building's landlord. She tapped into her foundation's resources, sending proposals back and forth with her team. She wanted the space to open as soon as possible, by early fall if she could manage it. The timeline was ambitious, but Rose was determined. She scoured estate sales, rummage sales, and local archives for historical photographs and items to display in the new center. She even purchased a few antiques and books from kinder local shop owners, who were thrilled by the prospect of having their wares featured in a community hub. Word spread quickly about her project. Some locals were a bit skeptical, but many were excited. Books offered to host a series of preview nights, where people could learn about the center's progress. The Italian bakery volunteered to cater the opening day for free. The local youth group expressed interest in volunteering. Throughout this process, Rose never once set foot in and daughters again. She didn't need to. And Sharon, for her part, maintained a stony silence, though rumors began to fly. Some folks whispered that Sharon was livid to see all the attention Rose was getting. Others said she was complaining that outsiders were taking over the town. Occasionally, as Rose walked down the street to check on construction, she would see Sharon glaring at her from behind the antique store's window. Rose would simply offer a polite nod, refusing to stoop to open hostility. The day finally arrived for the grand opening of the community center, which Rose had decided to call the Open Door Collective. The name felt fitting, a warm invitation to anyone who wished to partake in knowledge, art, and culture. The space had been transformed in just a few short months. Where once there were dusty floors and empty walls, now stood polished wood floors, bright lights, and expansive galleries. One corner housed a cozy reading nook complete with shelves of donated books, including classics and children's literature. Another area featured local artwork and historical displays, with photographs of the town from its earliest days to the present. There was even a small stage for open mic nights, lectures, or community performances. That morning, the air buzzed with anticipation. The mayor was scheduled to cut the ribbon at noon, and already a line of curious townspeople had formed outside. Rose stood by the entrance, greeting everyone with a warm smile. Her assistant was busy inside, helping arrange last-minute details. Nearby, the Italian bakery owners were setting up trays of pastries, their sweet aroma wafting into the crisp autumn air. Rose took a moment to admire the crowd. It was diverse. Families with young children, elderly couples who had lived in the town forever, teenagers eager to check out the new space, and some folks who had driven in from neighboring towns just to see what the fuss was about. Rose felt a rush of gratitude and humility. She had poured her heart into this project, and seeing the community's excitement was the best reward she could imagine. At noon sharp, the mayor arrived. Cameras flashed as the crowd cheered. A red ribbon stretched across the entrance, and the mayor held a giant pair of ceremonial scissors. She gave a short speech praising the collaboration that made the Open Door Collective possible. She thanked Rose personally, which elicited more applause. Then, with a triumphant snip, the ribbon fell away and the doors swung open, allowing people to enter the bright, inviting space. For the first hour, Rose moved through the center, greeting visitors, answering questions, and occasionally stepping aside to watch the wonder unfold. She felt tears of happiness threaten every time she saw a child's eyes light up at the sight of the reading corner or an elderly resident pausing before a vintage photograph of the town's old train station, recalling memories from youth. The synergy she had hoped for was alive and electric. Midway through the event, Rose noticed a figure standing alone near a display of antique postcards. It was Sharon. She was dressed in her usual crisp attire, her hair styled neatly. She held a glass of punch in one hand and was studying the postcards with a look that was hard to read. For a moment, Rose felt a mixture of apprehension and pity. She wondered why Sharon had come. Perhaps curiosity got the better of her, or maybe she felt compelled to see what this outsider had created. Rose approached slowly, unsure whether Sharon wanted to speak or would storm out at the sight of her. "Hello," Rose said gently, stopping a few feet away so as not to crowd her. Sharon didn't immediately turn around, but Rose could see the tension in her posture. "I'm glad you came," Rose added. Sharon let out a quiet scoff, but she didn't leave. Instead, she reached out and lightly touched one of the postcards, a vintage image of the old county fair. "I remember that fair," Sharon said at length. "I was just a little girl. My father used to run a booth selling antiques and trinkets." Rose nodded, noticing the vulnerability in Sharon's voice. She wondered if the older woman was recalling a happier time, before her life became filled with bitterness and suspicion. She took a small step closer. "We included it because it's part of the town's history," Rose said softly. "We wanted people to see how much heritage is here." Sharon's gaze flicked to Rose, and her eyes seemed to hold 1,000 swirling emotions. Anger, regret, pride, and perhaps a glimmer of envy. "You've built quite a place," she admitted grudgingly. "Bigger than anything I expected." Rose offered a gentle smile. "I hope it benefits everyone in town, including you." Sharon didn't respond right away. She shifted her weight, looking around the center at the bustling crowd. Families laughed, friends chatted, and volunteers guided people through the exhibits. Sharon began, then paused, biting her lip as though grappling with unspoken words. Finally, she managed. "What makes you think you understand this town so well? You just showed up and started changing things." Rose's smile faded to a more thoughtful expression. "I don't think I understand everything. I'm sure I still have a lot to learn. But I believe in community, in shared spaces that bring people together. And from what I've seen, most folks here want that too." Sharon's eyes lowered, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Maybe," she said softly, "but we've always done things a certain way here." Rose's heart clenched a bit, sensing the fear behind Sharon's hostility. Change can be scary. Letting new people in can be scary. "I'm not here to erase traditions," Rose said gently. "I want to celebrate them. My only hope is to help this town thrive and welcome everyone who wants to be part of it." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the hum of conversation filling the space around them. Sharon took a shaky breath. I said some things, she began haltingly, her voice thick with guilt. Things I shouldn't have said. Rose felt her eyes grow moist. She hadn't expected an apology. She'd hoped for acceptance, maybe some mutual respect, but an outright admission of guilt felt profound. She nodded slowly. I know, she replied softly. I was hurt by them. Sharon's shoulders sagged. I was angry, she explained, her tone almost pleading. My business has been struggling, and I guess I resented the idea that someone else could come in and do better than me, especially someone who— Her words trailed off, and Rose filled in the unspoken part. Especially someone who is black, who you see as an outsider. Sharon swallowed hard, looking at the floor. But that doesn't excuse what I said. Rose exhaled, releasing a bit of the tension that had built up. I appreciate you acknowledging it. I really do. People can change, Sharon. It's never too late. Sharon stared at the postcards for another moment, then glanced around the bustling space. I can't undo my words, she said, her voice shaky. But maybe I can learn to accept this place, and you, for what you're trying to do. A gentle warmth bloomed in Rose's chest. She nodded. That's all I can ask, she replied softly. Sharon nodded in return, and for a fleeting second, Rose thought she saw genuine regret etched in the older woman's features. Then, as if embarrassed by her vulnerability, Sharon squared her shoulders. Well, I should go, she said abruptly. She set down her glass of punch and quickly walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Rose stood there for a moment, her heart a complex mix of sadness, relief, and cautious hope. After the opening day ended and the crowds dispersed, Rose sat alone in the reading corner, reflecting on the journey that brought her here. From the moment Sharon kicked her out of the antique store to this triumphant grand opening, and Sharon's surprising presence, so much had changed in a short time. She thought about the moral lesson she had gleaned. Prejudices can run deep, but communities and individuals have the capacity to grow and heal, given the right opportunities and a willingness to confront old wounds. In the following weeks, the Open Door Collective became a regular part of the town's fabric. Local bands played on the small stage. Families hosted birthday parties in the event room. A local writers' club started meeting weekly in the reading nook. The youth group organized a film night, and on one particular afternoon, Rose noticed Sharon slipping in quietly, browsing some of the displays with a thoughtful expression. They exchanged a small, respectful nod from across the room. Then came the day that took Sharon, and much of the town, by complete surprise. Word had spread that the Philanthropic Foundation's CEO planned to visit the Open Door Collective for a public Q&A about future projects. Everyone in town was invited. A hush fell over the center that evening, as people gathered in neat rows of folding chairs in front of the small stage. Up front, introduced the CEO in glowing terms, explaining the corporation's dedication to community enrichment. Then welcomed the CEO to the stage. Sharon was seated in the second row, arms folded, eyebrows raised in curiosity. When Rose stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, a ripple of shock passed through the audience, those who didn't already know. Sharon's mouth fell open, eyes widening in incredulity. She stared at Rose in utter disbelief. Rose, for her part, kept her composure, though her heart hammered in her chest at the dramatic reveal. She introduced herself formally as Rose Taylor, CEO of the Philanthropic Foundation that had financed the Open Door Collective. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some folks smiled knowingly, while others reacted with stunned applause, realizing just how deeply Rose had been involved all along. Sharon's face flushed with a sudden mixture of embarrassment and awe. She remembered kicking Rose out of her store, mocking her as an outsider. She remembered calling her "you people" and accusing her of having no respect for antiques. Now she understood Rose was not just some casual browser or newcomer. She was a person of influence and resources who had made a profound, positive impact on the community in a matter of months. At the end of Rose's speech, which focused on the future expansions of community programs and scholarships, she opened the floor for questions. One older lady stood up and thanked Rose for everything she had done. A teenager asked how they could volunteer. Each time, Rose answered humbly, deflecting praise onto the local residents who had made the project flourish. Finally, after a few more questions, Sharon rose slowly from her seat. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling a bit as she spoke. Sharon hesitated, her gaze flicking around the room, aware that many eyes were upon her. Then she turned her attention to Rose, her posture stiff with nerves. I wanted to say thank you, she managed. I know I haven't been the most welcoming, but seeing what you've accomplished here, I realize how important this all is, and how wrong I was to judge you." A hush fell over the audience. Rose smiled gently, feeling tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you," she replied. "I appreciate that more than you know." Sharon swallowed hard and continued. "I've been thinking, maybe my store could, well, we have some antiques that could be displayed here. Items that reflect the town's past. If you'd like to collaborate, that is." The audience shifted in their seats, clearly recognizing the significance of this olive branch. Sharon was not only apologizing in public, but offering a form of partnership. Rose's heart brimmed with gratitude and relief. "I would love that," she said, her voice warm. "We can talk more after the Q&A." Sharon nodded and sat back down, her face a mixture of relief and lingering embarrassment. The crowd applauded quietly, some folks exchanging smiles, sensing they had just witnessed a powerful moment of reconciliation. Rose took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. Later, as the evening wound down and people dispersed, Sharon approached Rose privately. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes downcast, "for everything I said, for the way I treated you. I shouldn't have let my fears and biases get in the way of seeing who you really are." Rose placed a comforting hand on Sharon's shoulder. "I forgive you," she said, "and I hope we can work together to make this community even stronger." Sharon nodded tearfully. "I'd like that." They parted with a tentative smile, both feeling the weight of their past animosity lift. In that moment, Rose realized the moral of this entire journey. True community means opening your heart to people who are different from you, acknowledging your mistakes, and making room for growth and understanding. It's never easy, especially where prejudice has deep roots, but it's possible with courage, dialogue, and empathy. In the weeks and months that followed, and daughters began contributing curated antiques and historical pieces to the Open Door Collective. Sharon, still reserved by nature, nevertheless participated in a few community meetings, offering her knowledge of the town's past. Locals noticed the change in her demeanor. She was still firm about protecting her merchandise, but she was no longer outright hostile to strangers. Occasionally, she even smiled at new customers who wandered into her store. Rose continued to oversee the community center's growth, balancing it with her responsibilities as CEO. She traveled between the town and the city, ensuring both her corporate duties and philanthropic endeavors flourished. Each time she returned, she felt more at home, as though the little town had adopted her as one of its own. On a warm spring afternoon nearly a year after the center opened, Rose strolled down Main Street, passing the antique shop's window display. She saw Sharon inside, showing a delicate porcelain teapot to a young couple. Sharon glanced up, caught sight of Rose, and offered a small wave. Rose waved back, smiling at how far they had come. Across the street, the Open Door Collective bustled with activity, children giggling in the reading corner, volunteers preparing for an open mic night, local artisans setting up a craft fair in the event space. Rose paused to take it all in, the synergy of a community that once might have turned its back on her, now thriving with unity and mutual respect. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the sun and the hum of life wash over her, feeling the presence of her mother's spirit in that moment, proud and content. Then she opened her eyes, stepping forward with confidence, ready for whatever new beginnings lay just around the corner.